Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cameron. Can we turn to some cultural or big picture issues, please? And in particular, the attitude of the Post Office towards its sub-postmasters. And can we start by looking at poll 00354059? Can you see that this is a draft management information review produced for the Post Office Group Executive? And can you tell us what the purpose of a management information review of this kind was?
I don't have a great recollection of this specific piece of work, and it's not an uncommon business problem. I've come across it before, but you do want to get your management information in the best shape you can so that you have one version of the truth and you're measuring the right things and you're doing it in the right way and that it's easily accessible to the people who need it. So it's often a matter of making sure that you've got some discipline about where you get the information from and you're presenting it in a consistent, decided way. And I think this was probably a sort of first go at trying to understand the landscape from my point of view.
Were these kind of documents produced with any regularity?
No, I don't think so.
You will see the purpose is described as to update the group executive of the recent management information review and recommend next steps and a longer-term route map to improve the management information which is available to steer Post Office to meet its strategic executives. And under paragraph 2.1, it says that a review has been carried out at the request of the group executive over a 7-week period under the sponsorship of Alisdair Cameron.
Yes.
So is that right, that this was
I think so.
under your sponsorship?
I believe so.
And so was this to introduce a system by which management information was regularly and uniformly provided to the group executive, or to review the way in which that information was provided and to potentially change it?
I think more the latter from memory.
You'll see from the foot of the page, and it's on the foot of every page, we just scroll down, please. Underneath the helpful triangle is Mr. Goodman's name.
Yeah.
And a date of May 2015. Who was Peter Goodman?
So he was a member of the finance team that was in place when I joined Post Office Limited, and he worked for us for another, I can't remember, but 18 months or so.
Thank you. Can we just look at a couple of things that the review, or at least this draft of the review, says? Look at page 2, please. And scroll down to the blue box. Under findings, the first finding, content, too much focus on sales volume, value and income. Does that mean that the Post Office was too focused on sales volume, value and income, or that the information that was provided to the group executive was too focused on sales volume, value and income?
I think it probably means both.
Right. Was it correct that the Post Office in March 15 was too focused on its sales volumes, value and income, in your view?
So I think, and it's probably a fairly standard CFO complaint, is a lot of commercial teams get very excited by sales volume. And the question that the CFO always asks is, well, yeah, but are we making a profit from it?
Yes.
And so I think it was, that was, as I remember it, the focus of that first line.
And then if we look at the third page, please. second blue box down, first bullet point, too many versions of the truth, credence, finance, local spreadsheets, client information, supply chain, and Royal Mail maintain own branch databases in addition to network-owned database. Firstly, can you explain in either the corporate world or in information technology or in management speak what a version of the truth means?
So you can look at a particular area, and depending, I'm struggling to think of an example off the top of my head, but depending on how you've chosen to manage it and what information you're disclosing, I don't know, if you look at customer complaints, if you, there are many different ways you can look at customer complaints, and it could be, on average, how long they take to answer, whether they're ever repeated, what's the longest answer. You know, there's lots of different ways you can look at it. And what you want in a perfect world is a single view of all those things measured from the right information. And so you might focus on one area, but you've got the others there measured in the same way. And when you've got too many versions of the truth, you've got a person who keeps their own spreadsheet that tells you, well, this is that, and then you've got a system over there that tells you how many, and they're not really properly aligned or consistent, and therefore someone can say, so, I mean, I can give you a real example on the profit, because I remember, a particular instance of this. So Credence produced sales volumes, but it wasn't very good at the values. So it was a reliable system for the volume. So I never used it for values because it had a limited ability to work out the value per product. So if you used Credence, you could say, oh, we've had a good week, but you might not have done in terms of value. It was only useful for branch volumes, whereas the finance system would tell you the rest. Sorry, does that help?
Yes, thank you. Going back to page 2, please. Too much focus on sales, volume, value, and income. Just scroll down, please. You tell us in your witness statement that at the heart of the issues experienced by Post Office was a culture which stopped us from dealing with postmasters in a straightforward and acceptable way. Did a focus on sales, volume, and value and income contribute to that failure?
As I say, I think the sales volume versus profit was the point I was trying to get to. So in that specific instance, really not. But I think throughout this, and I made comments in my witness statement about the audit committee, we were consistently treating postmasters as someone else rather than as a core part of Post Office.
And why was that?
Well, I think technically, of course, the vast majority of postmasters are independent third parties, and so it was sort of technically true. And I think we were absolutely focused, and I was being absolutely focused on, well, the two big focuses of my first few years in Post Office was getting the financial controls right and getting the profit to improve, the trading profit. And so in both cases, you're very much focused on what's on your balance sheet and what's in your P&L and not on other people. And I think there was a relentless focus on that.
And so that you don't draw a direct line between what's recorded here and the way in which Post Office treated its sub-postmasters?
Not on the specific comment about sales volume, because as I say, I think, but I mean, it's a long time ago now, but I think that specific reference was income versus profit rather than Post Office versus postmasters, but the wider point still stands.
Thank you, that can come down. We've seen in your What Went Wrong paper, you set out your belief that at the heart of the issues experienced by the Post Office was a culture that stopped the Post Office from dealing with postmasters in a straightforward and acceptable way.
Yes.
And you tell us in your witness statement, no need to turn it up, it's paragraph 386, quote, this skewed Post Office's judgments about prosecutions and the subsequent management of the litigation. In what way did the Post Office culture stop the Post Office from dealing with postmasters in a straightforward and acceptable way?
I think by setting out the belief we referred to earlier that a postmaster was accountable for whatever happened in a post office, I think, yes, there was a logic to it, but it gave post office an excuse in a way not to investigate it, because the burden was on the postmaster rather than post office and post office's financials. And I think one point where I saw that, and it was a genuine moment of being ashamed, is one of the areas I hadn't really looked at was suspensions. And the judge obviously told us that we couldn't, that we had to pay people during a period of suspension. And when, he said that, you thought, yeah, no, that must be right. So we started doing that. And a few months later, one of the operational people, told me that, because this was now a cost to post office, the number of suspensions and the duration of the suspensions had fallen. And I thought, oh, that is just awful, isn't it? Because it wasn't in our P&L, we just didn't prioritise it. And the second it's in our P&L, we do a better job and a fairer job, and I was really ashamed of that.
The culture about which you speak in the paper and in your witness statement, which prevented or stopped Post Office from dealing with postmasters in an acceptable way, who drove that culture?
I think, we all did in a way, because it was the focus on so the absolute, from shareholder to board to executive team, and absolutely to me, I was absolutely part of this, the focus was on improving trading profit in the belief that we could provide the investment in the business and that government subsidy would reduce over time. And it did. I think its peak was 415 million, and it was down to sort of 50 million at one point, although not sustainably so. And, that felt like an important component of making the business sustainable.
Just stopping there.
Please.
Do I understand you to say that the government encouraged the drive for profit?
Oh, yes.
Did it demand the drive for profit?
I don't think demand is... So in setting its priorities, and the priorities of the shareholder representative, improving commercial performance, making it more commercially sustainable, was a priority for everyone, absolutely.
Were members of the General Executive incentivised to contribute to that drive for profit by their own personal remuneration?
Yes, absolutely.
Would you agree that up until the time that you speak about of the two judgments,
yeah,
the 2019 judgments, the drive for profit was central to the Post Office's strategy?
Yes.
To the detriment of sub-postmasters?
I didn't think so at the time, because one of the engines of improving the profit was to very assertively reduce the costs of Post Office Limited, its staff costs and its non-staff costs. And I've always believed that doing that was very pro-postmaster. And when I've spoken to postmasters, they would all say, in my experience, that Post Office was too expensive, too bureaucratic, sucking up too much of the income and its own staff. And so I genuinely thought taking 100 million a year out of those costs was good for everybody, because in any given year there was more money available for postmasters and more money to invest in the business and make it run better and be more resilient. That said, we could have absolutely taken a different view of how we invested that money and where we invested that money, and done far more, which we started to do much more in 2019-20, to make the business simpler and better for postmasters.
You tell us in your witness statement, there's no need to turn it up, it's paragraph 6, that, quote, it became clear to me in 2019 that postmasters needed far greater support, and this demanded a culture shift in the post office.
Yeah.
What was it about 2019 that made it clear to you that postmasters needed far greater support?
So it had been developing over 2018. So Debbie Smith was retail director in 2018, and she had worked at Boots for a long time. And she was making the point, really quite clearly, that in her experience as a, proper retailer, we didn't treat postmasters with as much support and, as much support as retailers like Boots would treat their own shops. And she wanted more people in the field, more support. And she and I and Rob Horton spent a few days in Chesterfield in the summer of 2018 trying to bring all these themes together. And she convinced me she was right. And so as I got more into that sort of interim chief executive space in 2019, that was the priority. It's the priority I set out to the board. It's the priority I set out in my speech to the NFSP.
We've heard from Mr. Davis, Mark Davis, that similarly in 2019 it was necessary to tackle a culture in some quarters which wrongly placed sub-postmasters in a subordinate role, as he called it. Do you agree that, at least until 2019, sub-postmasters were seen by the post office as being in a subordinate role?
Never really thought about that phrase, and I don't know precisely what Mark was alluding to, but they were seen as sort of someone else, a third party, like a client to some extent, and just didn't get, as Debbie got more into it, there were people who just hadn't had a visit, postmasters who hadn't had a visit from the post office for years. And
how about that they weren't seen as de facto business partners of the post office, which they were, given their financial investment in their post offices?
They hugely were. And the one that really sort of took me aback was when I was doing that NFSP conference. And I said, postmasters are the heart and the blood or something of post office, which of course they are, because, the DMBs are a red herring. There's 11,500 post offices and whatever there were, 150 at the time, directly managed branches. And so, without postmasters, there is no post office. And Post Office Limited only exists, to keep postmasters in post offices. And so I said...
Sorry to interrupt. Were they seen as a different kind of species, essentially, from
I think they were
centrally managed, directly managed branches?
Yes.
And as a lesser form?
No, I don't think that's right, because we were furiously shutting directly managed branches at the time. But the bit, sorry to complete the too long anecdote, I did that speech 10 minutes, and a postmaster stopped me as I came out in the break and said, you said that, did you really mean it? And I said, well, yes, of course I did. It's obvious post office doesn't function without postmasters. And he said, no one has ever said that to us before. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's worse than I thought.
You tell us in your witness statement, perhaps you better turn it up, it's page 13, paragraph 56. You say, paragraph 56, foot of the page, with hindsight, I feel that the ARC, that's the Audit, Risk and Compliance Committee,
yes,
which is a committee of the board,
yes,
did not tackle the evidence underpinning the performance of Horizon, nor meaningfully consider the potential outcomes for postmasters if there were issues with shortfalls and balancing postmasters are rarely mentioned in the documents and are treated as a third party rather than an integral part of the business.
Yes.
Is it implicit in that paragraph there that responsibility for tackling the evidence concerning the performance of Horizon fell to the Audit, Risk and Compliance Committee of the board?
No, I wouldn't say that, but I think it should have been there in the risk registers. There should have been discussions about, well, how are we doing this? Are we doing enough? Are we doing the right things? Where's the evidence? Which there were in other areas.
To your knowledge, was, sorry to speak over you, Mr. Cameron, the integrity and reliability of the Horizon system ever on a risk register?
Looking back at the documents, I don't think it was.
And do you know why that was?
I am speculating a bit. It didn't strike me as peculiar until I went back and read the documents now, but I assume that Horizon was seen as fundamentally a Fujitsu accountability. But I mean, that isn't an excuse. Reading it back again, it clearly feels wrong.
Where within the organisation would responsibility rest for the drawing up of an appropriate risk register that would have included or should have included Horizon on it?
So I think those teams reported to Jane McLeod from 2015 to 2019 and to me after Nick arrived.
So you from, can you give us a date?
Middle of 2019,
Okay.
after Jane left.
Yes. How big were the teams that drew up the risk register?
I'm thinking half a dozen people, because the view was that the risk registers should be drawn up across the business by different parts of the business, and the job of the risk team, although I'm sure it evolved at points, was to help them do that and then consolidate a view that the audit committee or the board or the executive could look at.
The misfunctioning or non-functioning of Horizon was plainly a risk to the business.
Yes, it was. And we were doing, obviously, work on income flowing through. And it wasn't unusual to me. I'd seen in the previous experience of not being able to sort of audit through a system. So the external auditors did a lot of work with Fujitsu on the controls around Horizon, and if they didn't think they were good enough in any particular year, they did additional substantive testing. We developed a whole financial control framework to go through all the income, follow it through, to reconcile it to third-party sources, to test it, do a lot of testing after the balance sheet date, and slow down the speed at which we signed the accounts to do more post-balance sheet testing. So there was a lot of work being done.
Again, can you assist as to why, to your knowledge, Horizon never made it onto a risk register of the post office?
I don't know that I can. I've suggested that it is perhaps that it was considered something Fujitsu was doing, but in reading the documents again for the purpose of this inquiry, it struck me as immediately as odd.
We hear quite often how many transactions a day, how many transactions a week, how many transactions a year, the amount of money that was put through the Horizon system or processed by the Horizon system. Isn't it self-evidently obvious that the non-functioning or misfunctioning of the system was a risk that ought to be registered?
Yes.
And control measures, I mean, the idea is not just to register a risk, it's to introduce control or mitigation measures to reduce or to eliminate the risk.
And I think a lot of that work was being done, and the fact it wasn't debated in the risk register doesn't mean it wasn't. But clearly, it would have been much more satisfactory if that had been openly and consistently debated through that period, and it wasn't.
Thank you. That document can come down. Did there ever come a time when you believed that it would be necessary or desirable for the Post Office to recommence prosecuting itself?
I asked the question on a number of occasions, as in, are we making a deliberate decision here? Do we know what the factors are? We never got to a point or anywhere close to it where we had a real conversation about under what circumstances would we, and we never got near a point where we thought about recommencing it. But it was definitely part of the background conversation.
Can we look, please, at poll 00249527? And look at page 2, please. And just scroll down, please. So it's page 3, not page 2. That's it, and just scroll down. An email of yours of the 27th of June 2017,
Yep.
under the heading Ops Board and Losses and Crime Group. Can you explain what that group was, please?
So Operations Board was, me working with people to consistently, probably monthly, review the performance, efficiency, costs of different operational teams.
That's different from the management board, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
And Losses and Crime Group, I think, and I must admit, I don't remember it particularly well, was, trying to understand where we were losing money and what we could do to stop that happening.
You say the guidance yesterday was that we should not attempt to prosecute any cases where the losses had arisen from or were identified via trading and Horizon rather than a straight theft until two things happen. Firstly, we complete the Deloitte work on systems reliance.
Yep.
Secondly, the CCRC opine. The former's fine, and I gather we are close. The second, I want to make as formal, sorry, I'll read that again. The second, I want us to make as formal a judgment with Paula engaged, because it's a big deal with an open timetable and a strong sense that this is now costing us blood. What did you mean by that sentence?
So, as I think I said earlier, I think there's three things in this. The first is this was going to be a big decision if we ever took it, and we never got close to taking it, and therefore I wanted us to do it thoughtfully and properly and make it as a big decision, which is something I really strongly believe in on many fronts. Secondly, it was a big deal if we ever changed that, and therefore Paula absolutely had to be engaged with this. This couldn't be a, lower level decision. It was a big decision. It would have to go to the board. We didn't know what timetable would be, and costing us blood, which is clearly not a phrase that reads well now, was simply saying that the losses in the network, which could be from a variety of causes, one might be shortfalls that we didn't recover, one might be theft and robbery by third parties, but those losses were growing over time and could continue to grow if we didn't do anything about it.
What did you mean by it's now costing us blood?
Well, that's what I mean, is the costs were going up. And the fear is, that they would keep on going up. As well as all the other accountabilities, we are accountable for managing a lot of public money. We have hundreds of millions of pounds of cash at any moment in post offices and moving back and forward, repatriating 80, 90 million a day now, because obviously, and we have to look after that money. It's taxpayers' money, and we have to be alive to that.
You continue. My preference would be to do the Deloitte work, and I think that's referring back to Deloitte work on systems reliance, is that right?
Yes, I think so.
What did you understand Deloitte were doing? This is mid-2017.
Yeah, I got at times a little bit confused between the Deloitte work that never really happened on suspense accounts,
Yes.
the Deloitte work for the chairman's review, the Deloitte work for the GLO preparation, and this Deloitte work. So I don't think I was ever entirely clear what Deloitte was doing, but clearly I understood that they were doing some work on the reliability of Horizon as part of that package of concern. And I think there's a document somewhere where they were doing work to see if they would be appropriate to be an expert witness.
Okay, at least that was your understanding.
Yes.
You say your preference would be for to do the Deloitte work and then seek a prosecution relying on Horizon in a single sympathetic case, i.e. admission, good evidence, not too sympathetic a postmaster, not part of the GLO, and then we will know. What did you mean, and then we will know?
Was the way the system was working capable of supporting a legal case if we were convinced that a postmaster had stolen money? So if we were convinced of that, and it was one of the cases where the evidence was relying on Horizon, would it stand up to legal scrutiny? And that was clearly important to all the future decisions. I didn't know whether it would or not. And that was the idea of saying, well, look, let's just take a case, not a controversial case or a political case, but let's just take a case, a new case, where we really believe that someone has stolen and put it in a court and see whether they agree or not. But of course, we never got anywhere near that.
You say, in the meantime, I have a specialist team setting up prosecutions that will never happen. What was that, the specialist team setting up prosecutions that weren't going to happen?
There was a smallish team, which sometimes I think worked for me, sometimes for Jay, who were the people who would collect evidence under PACE and had done so in relation to earlier prosecutions. And this was partly a sort of budget argument between myself and Jane, because I was sort of saying, well, we need to keep cutting our costs if we're not going to be using these teams to do any prosecutions, then presumably we don't need that level of skill.
We can lay them off, as you say here.
Sorry?
And we can lay them off, as you say here.
Yeah. So if we didn't need them and we could do investigations differently, then my question was, do we need them?
To what extent were the proposals that you were making here connected to or separate from the product of the chairman's review conducted by Jonathan Swift?
As far as I was concerned, completely separate. I never saw the product of the chairman's review.
You never saw it in your time at the post office?
No.
Did you know about it?
I knew it was happening, but I never saw the output that I remember or anything I've seen in documents. I don't think I saw it.
Can we look at your witness statement, please? That document can come down at paragraph 37, please. And if we read paragraph 37, you say, during 2016 to 17, I understood that Tim, that's Tim Parker, commissioned a chairman's review at the request of Baroness Neville Rolfe to investigate matters related to postmaster complaints and the mediation scheme. I do not know how this work was reported or how it was transitioned from the chairman's review into preparation for the group litigation. The work was legally privileged, and my recollection, it was not shared even with the board. You were later included in work on suspense accounts. On reflection, the board should have insisted on seeing and understanding this work as part of our preparation for the group litigation. You give us, you say there the work was legally privileged. by mentioning that, are you giving that as a reason or a possible reason why it was not given or shared with you?
That was my understanding.
Where did you get that understanding from?
Well, I thought it was from Jane.
So Jane, you think, Jane McLeod told you that the reason why Jonathan Swift's review was not being shared with you was because of privilege?
That's my recollection. But, when you hear from her, if she disagrees,
We're not going to hear from her.
Okay.
She lives abroad.
Okay.
And won't cooperate.
Wow.
So that's why I'm asking you.
Okay, so that is my recollection, was that Jane was holding this. And when you speak to Tim Parker, he can probably explain what he was told by Jane as to how this material had to be handled. But my understanding was that this was legally privileged and couldn't be shared except with the chairman, and that was it.
Did that understanding that you got from Jane McLeod extend to that being the reason that the board didn't get to see the report from Jonathan Swift too?
Yes.
Did the board, to your knowledge, know about the existence of the chairman's review?
Oh, yes.
Was there, to your knowledge, a summary or a synthesis of it given to the board?
Not as far as I recall.
So does it follow that the board knew of the existence of Jonathan Swift's review, but didn't ask to see it, to your knowledge?
I think that's right. I think they've been told they weren't going to see it, and I don't remember there being a particular argument or debate about that. But knowledge may be incomplete.
Did you ever question the suggestion that it was a privileged document, i.e. had been prepared for the purposes of, in broad terms, litigation?
Yeah,
or in contemplation of litigation?
I don't think I did, which, was clearly wrong. Where I did push back was on things that were, specific, like if there was work being done on suspense accounts, I was saying that I have to know that as CFO. But more broadly, no, I didn't.
Thank you. My last topic then, please, the NFSP. Can we look, please, at paragraph 405 of your witness statement, please? I'm so sorry, it's 411 on page 107. Foot of the page. This is the chapter or section of your witness statement that deals with the NFSP. And you say that at the General Executive on the 12th of March and the board meeting on the 18th of June 2015, the Post Office approved a new agreement with the NFSP, whereby the Post Office would provide most of the NFSP's funding. The agreement also included a clause that the NFSP could not criticise the Post Office in public. It's clear to me that these facts undermined the NFSP's independence from the Post Office in its representation of sub-postmasters. Yes?
Yes.
So was it your understanding, what was your understanding as to the extent to which the Post Office provided NFSP funding before March 15?
I don't remember, actually. So I think it had provided some, but nothing like as much as now is being proposed. But I could be wrong, I don't remember.
what was your understanding before March 2015 as to whether any agreements between the Post Office and the NFSP included clauses forbidding the NFSP from criticising the Post Office in public?
I'm not sure until it came to the group executive that I'd thought about the NFSP much in my first couple of months, but my memory is that those clauses were new.
Can we look, please, at NFSP 401075? Can you see this is the grant framework agreement between the Post Office and the Federation?
Yes.
I think this is the agreement to which you're referring, isn't it?
I think so.
And can we look, please, at page 10? And can you see, under general conditions of the grant, paragraphs, and we're going to look at 5.1, 5.2 and 5.3. At 5.1, both parties shall use reasonable endeavours to identify any issues which will or may create tension between the interests of the Post Office and those of Post Office operators, and use reasonable endeavours to resolve any such issues. For the avoidance of doubt, it's acknowledged that the NFSP may, 1, represent individual Post Office operators, 2, discuss and comment on Post Office's initiatives, policies and strategies with its membership, 3, publicly comment on the same, 4, state and explain its opinion on the same, even if not in support of the Post Office, 5, lobby relevant stakeholders such as Business Innovation and Skills and Royal Mail Group on behalf of its members. 5.3, the NFSP shall not engage in any of the following activities or behaviours. 1, undertaking any public activity which may prevent Post Office from implementing any of its initiatives, policies or strategies. 2, undertaking or inducing a third party to undertake media or political campaigns against the Post Office. 3, organising or inducing a third party to organise public demonstrations, protests or petitions against the Post Office. 4, organising or inducing a third party to organise boycotts of Post Office business. 5, funding or inducing any third party litigation against the Post Office. And 6, other activities or behaviours, the effect of which may be materially detrimental to the Post Office. The agreement does not, therefore, contain a clause, and this is the only relevant part of it, I believe, that the NFSP should not criticise the Post Office in public, does it?
Reading it again, it doesn't. I believed it did, and I believed we sort of waived the clause in 2019, and I had always understood that that was the case, but I didn't go back and read this. I think there is a reference in one of the documents as to the clause we unpicked in 2019, and whether it's 5.3 here.
It is. There is a deed of variation prepared in 2019, which at paragraph 2.1.8 proposes to delete some parts of clause 5, including paragraph 5.3. Just for the record, the cross-reference is NFSP 401082. But that variation in 2019 doesn't affect the fact that as originally drafted in 2015, there isn't a clause which prohibits the NFSP from criticising the Post Office in public.
I thought there was. I apologise.
Where did you get that understanding from?
I think it must have been from the conversations in 2015. I think there was a sense of, well, if we're going to be paying all the money, they can't, call us out in public. But clearly, wiser heads prevailed, and it was a more limited set of restrictions. I still think a lot of 5.3 is onerous, and reducing it in 2019 was the right thing to do.
Well, in fact, the deed of variation hasn't been signed, I think, by the Post Office.
My goodness, okay.
And
I didn't know that.
No. despite, as I understand it, the NFSP seeking to persuade the Post Office to do so.
I do find that peculiar, because I think as interim CEO I stood up and said that we would, or had, so I'm astonished.
Mr. Cameron, thank you very much for answering my questions. I believe there are some questions on behalf of one call participant, namely Mr. Steen, on behalf of the Howe & Co Group. Oh, sorry, two call participants, sir. 5 minutes on behalf of the HJA Group.
I'm only hesitating because I'm wondering whether it's very nearly 20 to 3, whether the questions are of such a length as we require some kind of break. If they're literally 10 minutes and 5 minutes, then obviously we'll carry on. But otherwise, we might need to think about a break.
So I'm assured by nods and non-verbal communication of other types that they are 15 minutes at most. So we'll finish by
So we'll carry on,
3,
yeah.
and therefore I don't think we need a break.
Oh, fine, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Just a very short number of questions about the finance team. In your witness statement, you said it's at paragraph 191. I don't intend to call it up. You say this: my emerging view across my first year at Pol was that the competence of the finance teams and the control environment were weaker than they should have been. There were people with operational capabilities undertaking financial roles. Am I right in thinking that's Chesterfield that you're talking about?
Yes.
And so, in effect, it's Mr. Rod Ismay's team at Chesterfield?
Yes.
When you started to worry about that, did you take it up with Mr. Ismay?
I don't know how much I did talk to Rod about it and how much I just got on with what I thought needed doing, which was to start to bring new people in and change the senior finance team and create a very formal and detailed financial controls framework that operated in the way I thought was appropriate from past experience, which took a couple of years to be fully embedded, and to progressively develop the finance team's capability, which is vastly better than it was then.
What impact did that have on the extent to which you felt able to trust Mr. Ismay?
I don't know that it had much impact. I think I always assumed that Rod was, telling me the truth as he understood it at the time. And I can't remember when this happened, but I did feel that we needed stronger people. So very little of the senior finance team. I think only one member of the very senior finance team, which he wasn't in at that point, survived more than a couple of years. And, we made progressive changes, and Rod was one of those. 2017-ish, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Cameron, as you may be aware, my name is Sam Steen. I represent a large number of sub-postmasters, mistresses, and other people that worked in branches. Just to try and help on the matter that you were dealing with Mr. Beer, you were talking about the agreement with the NFSP and your thoughts that they had had an extra restriction on criticising Post Office. The term that's used, which might be described as a catch-all, is, I won't bring up the document, I'll just repeat it. The NFSP shall not engage in any of the following activities or behaviours. And then the sixth point for that is any other activities or behaviours, the effect which may be materially detrimental to the Post Office. Do you think that that is where you drew the conclusion that it's a bit wider than it seems?
It may have been, I don't recall.
In 2019, you encouraged, I think, in a speech, that the NFSP should be more active.
Yes.
And in fact, I think in your statement, again, I don't need to take you to it, you think that they did become more active and that led to an increase in pay.
So I thought the brilliant work the NFSP did was in second quarter of 2019, because they did the survey of members, and whilst the Court of Postmasters or whatever it was going to throw the keys in wasn't, I think, sort of literally true, I think it was a really impressive signal of intent. And I thought they lobbied to get the select committee very effectively and really ramped it up. I actually felt then when they turned up at the select committee, they slightly lost their nerve and didn't push the point as hard as they might have done. And I've always said the same things to the NFSP, and they get irritated with me for doing so, which is that if this was working right, postmasters would voluntarily pay the subs to fund the NFSP because they would see value in it. And then they wouldn't need to be funded by Post Office Limited. They're only funded by Post Office Limited because postmasters won't fund it. And if postmasters funded it because they really felt they were standing up for them, then that would be better.
Because they'd feel invested in the organisation.
Yeah,
and part of it.
Postmasters would be comfortable that the NFSP was really standing up for them.
Now, help us going back now to 2015. Why did the Post Office want to, I'm going to use the word shackle, why did the Post Office want to shackle the NFSP in this way? Now, you've explained why Post Office needed to pay.
Yeah.
You've not explained why it is that you think that there was this need to mute them at that time.
I don't really remember, but I think there was a sense of, well, if we're paying for it, you know, they can't just walk out and criticise us. And, you know, it may even have been me that said that, I can't remember. But I think it was that sense of, well, if we're paying for everything, you know. And I mean, lots of people have different views on what's independence. But my view was very firmly sort of trained in from an external audit relationship where I'd spent a lot of my career. And it's really, really clear that if you're getting a lot of your income from one source, you're not independent of that source. It's like, oh, I mean, I'm independent of Post Office. Well, of course I'm not, because they pay my salary. And, you know, and that was my sense of it.
And obviously this is the same time, 2015, whereby there's the issues have exploded all over the Post Office already, but
Yeah.
they are continuing.
Yeah.
All right, now I'm going to turn to a different matter, and I'm going to be drawing on your expertise and training as an accountant, and then your work in the Post Office, all right?
Okay.
Okay, now, stop me when I go wrong with this, because you may well understand this better than I do. First of all, the starting point is that the Horizon system is meant to be a double-entry bookkeeping system, yes?
Yes.
Overall.
So, yeah.
Right. So what should happen is that money coming in should be accounted for against an item. So I'm going to use stamps as my example, all right?
Okay.
So money coming into a branch for 20 stamps, that should be capable of being accounted within the system, presumably using a date mark and some reference point to it being stamps. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think the transaction should be recorded.
Transactions should have an identification.
Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, you don't know what on earth the money's for.
Yeah.
Again, that's right. All right. Now, we know from the evidence of sub-postmasters and mistresses and their managers and their assistants that what would happen when trying to balance accounts on occasions would be that Horizon would say there's a shortfall.
Yes.
But it would not be referenced to a particular item like stamps or anything else. It would just say there is £5,000 that there should be here, and then sub-postmasters, their helpers, their family members would then try and find wherever they could. It would take hours and hours, evening after evening. They were trying to find out what this £5,000 represented.
Yes.
You've heard that evidence?
Yeah.
Right. So help us a bit more with this. When the Post Office, through the Horizon system, theoretically identified a shortfall, I'm using 5,000 as an example, of £5,000 for a branch. That wasn't referenced by the post office to a particular transaction. That's not what the sub-postmasters say. They don't say that they were told, look, it's the stamps or something else. They were just told, it's £5,000.
Yes.
Help us try and understand how that could occur, how the post office would just simply say it's £5,000 and not reference to any particular transaction with identification.
Because I think what you had was a cash shortfall. So what the post office view was, at this point you said you had this much cash last time you did a cash declaration or last time it was counted or whatever it was. And these are the transactions flowing in and out. But if this was a few days, that would be easy. If it was 18 months, you were getting downloads from Fujitsu, there were hundreds and hundreds of transactions. But if you flow through all those transactions, you should now have £20,000 in cash left. And we've counted it, and there's 15.
Yeah. So by it being identified in that way as a
Yes.
cash shortfall,
Yes.
from the sub-postmaster's point of view, it wasn't identified as being, again, I'll go back to my stamps. It wasn't identified as being £5,000 out of the stamps, transaction till.
No, exactly.
From their point of view,
Yes.
it didn't have an ID.
Or from post office's point of view.
Yeah.
So they didn't, post office wouldn't have known what had gone wrong, if you like, in order to make up that shortfall. The whole point was post office didn't know what had happened.
Yeah, okay, so let's just take this one step further. Now, the sub-postmaster has been confronted with this shortfall. We know that the systems within, and discussed by, in the judgments of Mr. Justice Fraser, were that the sub-postmasters were under pressure, putting it as neutrally as I can, to pay up for shortfalls.
Yes.
Right. And you've gone through, in your evidence with Mr. Beer earlier today, about how you think that started, because it was a way of, we didn't know what happened in the branches.
Yes.
All right. So let's stay with my example. Shortfall, £5,000, sub-postmaster trying to work out what on earth's going on. It's not identified to a transaction. Okay. So next step is, sub-postmaster is under pressure to pay the £5,000 shortfall. And we've heard examples of people selling down pensions and raiding piggy banks and things, dreadful things. Yeah. Right. They pay the money in to balance that shortfall, yes?
Yes.
Now, going back to when suspense accounts occurred, that would be what would be occurring, yes? So money would be disputed by putting it into suspense and then eventually paid off.
No, I think this is where we have to be careful of terminology, and I'm very careful on this in 2015. So in 2015, the suspense accounts were accounting balance sheet accounts in which unresolved transactions were held, and these were primarily customer issues. So they weren't about the postmasters.
Okay, that's 2015.
So that's 2015. I do say in one of the emails that's in my evidence pack that my understanding in 2015, what I've been told, is that the local branch accounts had been called suspense accounts 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
And I specifically ask, are we sure with the second site investigation that they want to talk about suspense accounts today, not the branch accounts? And they said yes.
Okay.
Or I was told they said yes.
Let's go back to my example, right? £5,000, postmaster pays it in. Now, when the postmaster pays in the £5,000, got through, however, loan shark or whatever they're paying it in,
Yes.
that then is being paid into the post office. And there's no transaction that's identified for it. They're simply paying off the shortfall. Do you agree?
Yes.
Right. So when that money is being paid in, identified shortfall, Horizon may be making it up, paid off by sub-postmaster. Now, that doesn't go back to any transaction, any purchase, anything that is bought or paid for at the branch at all. Where is that accounted for within the accounts? Do you understand what the problem is? No transaction identification.
Well, I'm happy to try and explain.
Yeah.
So when a shortfall is identified, there is a potential loss to the post office in the sense that it views that money as should be there. The system says it should be there, and it's not there. So there's a debit. And at first, that debit was held as an amount owed by the postmaster. So we're saying, until proved otherwise, this is the postmaster's accountability, and they owe us the money, was the way it was accounted for. And then after 60 days, so quite a short space of time, if the postmaster hadn't paid that amount back, what Post Office considered a debt, then it was written off to the profit and loss account. So it was a loss for Post Office compared to what it believed the position was at that point. And then
If they did pay it, though.
If they did pay it, then there wasn't a loss to Post Office because the money was restored to where the system said it should have been.
But it was never referred, ever, in the situation that we're describing, to an actual transaction. It was never referred to stamps or any other transaction that might take place.
Unless, we'd found a specific explanation.
Right.
We didn't know what had caused it.
Right. So going back to my example, where you've got this £5,000 being identified, theoretical 5,000 by the Horizon system, sub-postmaster paying it in.
Yes.
Was there any, at that stage, then someone designated to go find out what on earth this was meant to represent? Go find out what on earth this transaction was meant to have been all about?
So I think at times people did try, but I don't think they tried hard enough. I mean, let's be clear, and that's part of what I was talking about in 2020, because it was just too convenient.
Yeah.
That the theory was only the postmaster knows what's happened, therefore, until proved otherwise, they owe us the money, and that will restore the system to where it was. And so I don't think there was enough investigation on that. And indeed, I think, Post Office General Counsel has said that no investigations before, a certain date would pass, Mr. Justice Fraser's test of evidence to support.
And the other consequence of this, I think you'll agree, Mr. Cameron, is that if you're not looking into things that relate to the shortfall, sub-postmaster stumping up the cash, getting it from wherever, and trying to identify where on earth this came from, then that's masking, again, potential problems in the Horizon system, because nobody's looking into it properly.
It might be.
Yeah, OK. Now, let's go back then a bit further. Now, the branch suspense accounts. Now, these were held locally. So branch suspense accounts were where shortfall identified, there was an ability that was removed around 2006 to put monies into suspense as a result of the impact programme. Are you aware of that?
I think I've heard it. I don't understand the detail of it.
Right.
Because it was a long time before.
It may be a long time ago, Mr. Cameron, but you've said in your evidence that you thought there were limited investigations and questions in relation to some matters, and one of those was suspense accounts. And you've also said later on in your evidence that when suspense account questions came up, you decided to look into this.
So
why didn't you go back and try and understand what on earth had happened in those earlier days?
So, happy to answer that. So in terms of what I think of suspense accounts, the proper balance sheet suspense accounts that I referred to and which we discussed with Second Sight in 2015, my understanding of the immediate task was to see if there was evidence of a problem in suspense accounts based on Second Sight's hypothesis. And I'm really clear in the emails that I didn't think there was. When Deloitte were asked to do work by the legal team, which included work on suspense accounts, I'm really clear in emails that I didn't think there was a problem, but if they were going to do the work, then they should do a proper job and go into not just the formal suspense accounts, but all the client creditor accounts that preceded them, which again, we had looked at a couple of the big ones and there hadn't been any evidence of a problem. But I thought, well, if you're going to do this, do a proper job and then we can just settle everyone's mind at rest. In the meantime, we were doing a huge amount of work on the financial controls framework. And so there were all sorts of investigations, checks, reconciliations, proof going on. And none of it suggested there was a problem in suspense accounts. And then later, at Lord Arbuthnot's request to Nick, we got KPMG, and I very deliberately didn't get involved in it. I just let it flow to do another investigation into suspense accounts in 2020, which is in my witness statement. And Post Office very kindly allowed us to put the papers reporting that, and we did Summer of 2020, they did an investigation into the current operation of suspense accounts. And then in November 2020, they had done a backward-looking one. And what they said is, there is no evidence of a problem in suspense accounts. There is not a problem in suspense accounts. Because if what Second Sight were worried about was happening, then one of two things must follow. Either there's a huge build-up of credits in the suspense accounts growing over time, or they were being released to the P&L, and they weren't. And we kept seeing this, and KPMG went through it with great care, and it wasn't happening.
Okay. So you mentioned that you were aware of the impact programme. Your words were, I think I've heard of it. All right. Were you aware the impact programme had an impact
No, I
on
don't.
suspense accounts? Was that something you ever came across and looked into?
No.
Okay. Couple last questions. I'm very conscious of the time. We're getting close to the 3 o'clock cut-off, okay? All right. Help us understand a bit more. To try and identify where the money went, all right? So let's go back to the branch suspense accounts, the ones that you don't know much about, that were abolished by the impact programme. How are we going to find out where that money went from sub-postmasters stumping up the cash from their family and friends, wherever they got it from, where that money went, when the Horizon system was at least, they believe on many occasions, at fault for it? Where did that money go? How do we find that out, Mr. Cameron?
Genuinely don't know. I was always asked questions by Second Sight and others about the operation at the time at which I was in the business.
Well, who should we ask, Mr. Cameron?
Well, I think I had assumed, and this may have been false, that the reason no one was asking to go back to 2005 or 2007 was because there just wasn't the data to do it, because otherwise, I mean, I'd have thought they would have done. So I don't know if there is information.
Who do we ask, Mr. Cameron? I'm aware, obviously, you're on sick leave, but who should we ask? Because I don't think we can ask you to do this. Who should be able to give us that information?
I think, ask Nick Reed, who's the CEO, and I mean, I'm not saying he's going to do the work, but he's the one who can marshal the resources and make it a priority and ascertain if it's possible at this time of day to go back as far as 2005.
And to get the records that would answer the questions for later suspense accounts, in other words, money being paid in the way we have discussed, to get those records going forward around the time that you were looking at this in the way that you've described, who do we go to for those?
Well, also Nick.
Right. Okay. You understand the concern that this is people's individual money,
Of course.
that they believe has literally been taken by the post office.
Yes.
And put into profit. Do you understand the problem?
I absolutely understand the problem. I've always been open to look at it. We've done a huge amount of controls work over the years. I think, and this is just a personal opinion, that the suspense accounts in terms of the formal client creditor and suspense accounts in the balance sheet are a red herring on this. I think we've done a lot of work over the years, and KPMG came in and checked it again in 2020. And they were pleased with the controls over it. They were pleased with the checks. And no one has found, if we were piling credits into suspense accounts, then either you could see them there or you could see them being released into the P&L account. And that has not happened. And
Did you see the records?
It's not for me to decide what post office.
Did you see the records for this, Mr. Cameron?
Which records?
The records you've just been talking about.
Oh, the KPMG work, yes, of course.
So you went through them yourself?
I read the reports and the underlying reports. I didn't go through individual transactions.
Okay. One last thing.
Yeah.
Angela van der Bogaard mentioned
Yes.
the fact that she had a bonus the same year that she was shown by the High Court judge, Mr. Justice Fraser, as being someone that was less than truthful.
Yes.
Is not being truthful to a High Court, is that not on the risk questions that relate to bonuses? Is it just something that the post office doesn't pick up?
I think the mindset in 2019, and you see that through the recusal and the appeals, was a belief that Mr. Justice Fraser wasn't treating post office witnesses and other witnesses fairly and on the same basis. And so I think there was a feeling that that hadn't been a reasonable judgment. And I think that was the reason why no one was taking it at face value. However, wrong that seems now.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron.
Thank you.
Is that it, Mr. Beer?
So it is.
All right. Well, Mr. Cameron, I'm very grateful to you for your very detailed witness statement and for answering many questions today. Thank you very much for your participation in the inquiry.
Thank you.
So we'll resume on Tuesday with Ms. Lyons, yeah?
That's it. Alwyn Lyons, 9:45 on Tuesday, sir.
Fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.